January 1947. Britain had only just begun to recover from the nightmare of World War II. People dreamed of peace, rebuilding cities, and a hot dinner without ration cards. No one suspected that the decade's main enemy would come not from a front line, but from northern latitudes. On January 23rd, a Siberian anticyclone swept over the islands, bringing the icy breath of the Arctic. Temperatures plummeted to record lows, and the sky was cloaked in heavy, leaden clouds that wouldn't lift for 7 long weeks. What began as an ordinary snowfall quickly turned into a national disaster. Snow fell every day, covering the country layer by layer. Winds of 80 knot-p packed this snow into dense walls, blocking roads and front doors. But the main problem wasn't just the cold, it was the state the country was in. Coal stocks, the primary source of heat and power, were depleted after the grueling war years. Britain was in a trap. A war-weary economy was completely unprepared for nature's decision to stage one more trial of endurance. By the end of January, Britain began to literally disappear under the snow. The snowfalls were so heavy that in southeast England, drifts reached heights of 5 meters. Villages in Kent and Essex were cut off from the world within hours. The government, preoccupied with post-war reconstruction, initially underestimated the scale of the threat. By the time ministers realized this wasn't just a cold snap, but a climatic catastrophe, it was too long. The wheel of crisis had turned. Coal trains were freezing on the tracks, and factories began to shut down one by one. Britain was entering its darkest and coldest winter of the century. By February 1947, the situation had spiraled out of control. Coal, the lifeblood of British industry and the only salvation from the cold, stopped reaching the cities. Huge coal barges were trapped in frozen ports. The sea off the English coast had iced over, turning maritime routes into icy gridlock. On land, the situation was no better. Hundreds of freight trains sat in sidings buried under meters of snow. Britain's railways, worn down by years of war, simply gave up. The nation's power grid collapsed. On February 10th, the government took a desperate and unprecedented step. A total ban on the domestic use of electricity was announced between 9 a.m. and noon, and from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Outside those hours, the voltage was so low that light bulbs barely glowed, and electric stoves couldn't even boil water. Industrial giants, factories, shipyards, and mines were forced to shut down production entirely. In an instant, over 4 million people were left without work and without pay, sitting in their freezing homes. London and other major cities turned into ghosts. In the evenings, the streets were plunged into absolute darkness. Even the famous Piccadilly advertising lights were switched off for the sake of economy. The only source of heat for most families remained a meager ration of coal issued by coupons. People stood for hours in the freezing cold to get a bucket of black gold, and those who didn't get enough were forced to break up furniture or fences for firewood. Britain, having won a world war, was now losing the battle for the most basic necessities, light and warmth in its homes. The life of an average Briton in February 1947 turned into a complex survival quest where every action depended on the power schedule. Families lived by the clock. When the electricity was cut, houses turned into icy vaults. Windows were covered inside with such a thick layer of ice that it had to be scraped off with knives. People didn't take off their coats and hats even while sleeping, covering themselves with all available blankets and rugs. Often the only warm place in the house was the bed. where several people would sleep together to share body heat. Kitchens became centers of improvisation. Since electric stoves were dead and gas was intermittent, people took to their yards. There, directly on the snow, they lit bonfires to heat water in old tin cans and cook meager stews. Food was still rationed, but because of the snowdrifts, deliveries of bread and milk stopped. In London, the famous black taxis and red buses stood frozen on the roadsides. Petrol was scarce, and the icy roads made any journey a deadly risk. The city that had survived the Luftwaffe's bombings was now silenced under a blanket of snow. The radio remained the only link to the world, but even that became a luxury. The BBC had to shut down most of its TV and radio channels to save energy, leaving only one information frequency. Families gathered around radio sets by the light of a single candle, listening to weather reports and government orders. During these hours, Britain resembled a besieged fortress. Despite the darkness and cold, the Blitz spirit re-emerged. Neighbors shared their last piece of wood, and signs on closed pubs read, "Closed because we're frozen, but we haven't given up yet." When it became clear that civilian services were failing, the government threw in its last reserve, the army. It was a strange war, where the enemy was not a man, but ice. More than 100,000 British soldiers who had only recently laid down their arms after the end of World War II were mobilized once again. But now, their rifles were replaced by shovels and pickaxes. They were even joined by German and Italian prisoners of war who were still held in camps across Britain. Former enemies now worked shoulder to shoulder, hacking through 15-foot drifts to reach blocked mines and railways. It was a true strategic operation. Soldiers used flamethrowers to melt ice on railway switches, and powerful army trucks to deliver food to cut off villages. At sea, the Royal Navy was ordered to bring coal convoys from the northeast ports to London at any cost. Ships pushed through icy slush, risking being crushed by ice right off the English coast. Every vessel that reached the Thames was greeted as a savior. It meant a few more hours of light and warmth for millions. But the work was grueling and dangerous. The frost was so intense that metal tools snapped in hands, and snow-covered cleared tracks just a couple of hours later. In Wales, miners continued to descend into the pits despite the blizzards raging above ground and their freezing families waiting at home. It was a battle for heat, where every sack of coal was worth more than gold. It was thanks to this incredible union of soldiers, prisoners, and workers that Britain did not plunge into total chaos. They literally pulled the country out of its snowy grave by hand, paving the way toward a spring that seemed like it would never come. In mid-March 1947, the Arctic's icy grip finally loosened. But for an exhausted Britain, this brought no immediate relief. The record cold was replaced by anomalous warmth and torrential rain. The colossal mountains of snow accumulated over 2 months began to melt simultaneously across the country. Since the ground was still frozen solid and could not absorb the water, the largest flooding in British history began. The rivers Thames, Trent, and Severn burst their banks, submerging entire towns and thousands of hectares of farmland. People who had just been shivering from the cold in their homes were now escaping the rising waters by boat. The winter of 1947 dealt Britain a blow comparable to the years of war. The nation's economy was undermined. Industry lost millions of man-hours, and agriculture lost most of its future harvest. This led to food rationing becoming even stricter than during the toughest war years. The the nation that had defeated fascism found itself on the brink of bankruptcy and starvation. It was this crisis that accelerated the end of the British Empire. It became clear that the country could no longer afford to maintain colonies when its own citizens were freezing in the dark. Today, 1947 is remembered as a symbol of incredible resilience. That winter left a deep mark on the culture and memory of a generation. It proved that no amount of technology or victory makes humans invulnerable to the power of nature. Yet it also showed the strength of the human spirit, how yesterday's enemies and war-weary people united to prevent their country from plunging completely into darkness. The winter of '47 was the last great trial of the post-war era, tempering the British character in a way no enemy on the battlefield ever could. If you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. As the creator, I would really appreciate it